Hey everybody, I'm Matt Williamson. I'm just here to do a quick recap video on the group Love. I just completed a two-part series on them recently. And as always, I sometimes come back and maybe I talk with somebody else. We go over some of the points I made, like I did with the Beach Boys series. That was 6 parts, so that needed some recapping. For the Love video here, the 2 parts that I did, there was a couple things I'd like to update. And one person asked me about, well, Matt, usually you talk about some of the compilations that are available to purchase, and you didn't do that with this one. So I'm going to do it now. The reason I didn't do it originally had to do more with bringing it in for a landing and not getting too long. So if you're a vinyl collector and looking to start with a Love record on anywhere in their catalog, this was one of the first ones I had, the Best of Love. This is from 1980. This is on Rhino. And if any of you, Rhino Records for me was a godsend. In the 80s, Rhino was the leader it was a reissue label that was the leader in rediscovering or reissuing 60s bands. So I could do a video just on my Rhino Records collection, which I may do someday. So this is the first, one of the early compilations, and it was much needed because Love at that time was not well known. All their albums were out of print. And in fact, this even got reprinted by 1986 for their Golden Archive series. This was the one I bought first. Both of these are identical tracks. They each have 16 tracks on it, and they're from the first 3 albums, so the first Love period, if you will. The original Love, as it's often referred to. So it's got great album cuts, a few of their singles. So this is a really good place to start if you're looking to pick up a piece of vinyl. The liner notes on the back are different, but that should hardly matter. Very good band history and some choice cuts of their best material. The second album I got was this one here, Love Live and Love Studio. And this came out in 1982. So I got this in the mid-80s. And the studio side comprises of 8 songs from the album Out Here. And that was from 1969. And some very good tracks. That's why I like that album a lot. And my first listening to these was just the 8 songs, so I didn't listen to the expansive double album. But the songs on here are, some examples are I Still Wonder, Listen to My Song, Willow Willow, Gather Round. So a very nice selection of songs. And on the back side, this is recorded live at Fillmore East. Some songs from the time period, the 1969 period. So this is out there if you want to pick up this. It's probably fairly cheap still. And all their albums are really not that hard to get. I think they've all been reissued. So I often get other comments. And one comment I got was from the guitar player, John Echols, in the band. And he was challenging me on some of the facts that I had, or the facts I didn't have in the video. Let me just give you an example of how he approached me here. He said there's a issue here where he said, I states with zero factual basis that we somehow allowed Arthur to gain control of our money, which is total bullshit. Why the fuck would we allow that? Arthur had no control over bookings or our money. If you claim to be doing the definitive piece on the group Love, at least do your homework and try to get it right. Well, it's quite a compliment to think that this is the definitive piece on Love, but I must say I have never claimed any of my band histories to be definitive at all. So let me just give you guys a little bit of a background, a little behind the scenes here on how I put some of this stuff together, and so you can see how I do my homework and how I at least try to get it right. So one of the books I used was a book called Forever Changes, Arthur Lee and the Book of Love. This is written by John Einerson. And John wrote this book that I also have on the Buffalo Springfield called For What It's Worth. There's something happening here. And Einerson's written books on the Byrds, Flying Burrito Brothers, Steppenwolf, Ian and Sylvia. What else have we got here? The Guess Who, Neil Young. So what I've read of his work is exemplary. His research is excellent and very deep, and his interviews are very thorough. So the book that I was not able to buy a hard copy of, I just have a download of it, is Forever Changes. And let me just read to you where I got my information from. This is Einerson talking. And this is on page 89 if you want to check my work. So the contract offered to the group, commencing on January 1966, was for 1 year with 2 further annual options. The contentiousness of the contract arose from a clause which stated that, quote, all checks should be made to Arthur Lee on behalf of the group, unquote. It was a stipulation that effectively granted Arthur complete control of Love's advances and royalties. This would become a bone of contention and eventually precipitate a lawsuit. So I just want to draw your attention to the actual quote he puts in here, which I'll read again. All checks shall be made to Arthur Lee on behalf of the group. Now, I'm assuming he put that in quotes because he's either quoting a person, reading off of a document, or he's got the actual contract. Don't know. But as I said, Anderson's work has always been very solid. So I took that for what it was. Not only that, further homework I did on this was this book, Pegasus Epitaph, by Michael Stuart Ware, the drummer. Now, Ware was the drummer on the second and third albums. He joined for Da Capo and Forever Changes. Now, he says something very similar, and this is at a different time. This is after Forever Changes. And he's talking about they're all meeting at Arthur's house. This is the 5-piece band, and some reps from Elektra had already left. When Don had gone, Arthur walked over to the bureau, opening a drawer, removing a stack of legal-sized documents. He laid them on the coffee table. Quote, this is Michael Stuart Ware quoting Arthur Lee. I met with another Elektra rep earlier, and he asked me if it would be all right if the company made out all royalty checks to me, and then I can write your checks out to you guys. He said that would save a lot of time and make it easier to get our royalties to us sooner. Is that okay? And they all agreed to that. So that corroborates something, a separate agreement that says essentially the same thing that Anderson was talking about. So that's where I got that information. So John Echols had gotten back to me, and he said, well, first of all, he talked about the management, the booking agency, and the accounting firm. So this does get a little bit convoluted. But he said that each group member, with the exception of Snoopy Pfister and Michael Stuart Ware, were signed individually and collectively to the entity known as Love and to Elektra Records. We as a group did not agree on how Mike and Snoopy were to be compensated, so the two of them were signed to Arthur personally. He paid them. So it seems to me that, according to what John Echols is saying, that maybe the two things that you just heard me read in both of these books, maybe were just for individual members and not for every member of the group. Now, that's not what Michael Stuart Ware says, and nor is it implied in John Anderson's book. So you see we've got conflicting information here, but this is normal. I mean, I do this stuff all the time, and you do find this stuff. So what you do is you try to lay it all out and make heads or tails of it, try to make the most sense out of it that you can. And I mean, I can see how it would offend a band member, but to some of us, it might be splitting hairs. I don't know, it matters to everybody. You still get the gist of the whole story. It doesn't change the history that much. So obviously I want to get it right, so that's why I'm bringing this stuff up to you now. And we had a band member with a problem with it. Now, one other thing John Echols mentioned, he said, in closing, Arthur Lee was an exceptional wordsmith and a fine singer. He was not some sort of crazed tyrant. Being clinically bipolar, Arthur was often difficult to deal with, and he made a lot of missteps. Stealing our money was not one of them. So a couple things here. First of all, I never called him a crazed tyrant, nor implied that, and I never said he stole any money either. So that is something, when you're commenting on somebody, you want to be as accurate as you can. And if I wanted to, I mean, I pulled plenty of punches on these videos. There's a ton of stuff on Arthur Lee I could have talked about, but it would have taken up too much time. I had to bring these videos in for a close. So one example of let's just call it bias. So Michael Stuart Ware's book is nowhere near as generous to Arthur Lee's character as John Echols is. Now, John Echols, so far as I know, has not written a book. He's done many interviews. I watched at least 5, maybe 7 interviews on him. They're all over YouTube. One of them by Rick Rubin. One of them by my colleague, Eric Calero, who runs the Vinyl Rewind channel, who actually hosted John Echols in his studio. So, I mean, I did as much as I could to get Echols' words. But this particular thing, I mean, you can't cover everything, obviously. But I will tell you that Echols probably enjoyed a better relationship with Arthur Lee than any of the other band members. And I think part of that has to do with his families go way back. His grandparents actually knew each other in Memphis. So they had a family history, and I think that Arthur Lee probably respected him more than any other member of the band, partly because of that history. And as we see years later, when Arthur Lee reformed Love and went on the road again, John Echols played with him. So, you know, there's so much information here. And as I said, I could have written a whole lot more about Arthur Lee in here that I didn't even put in the video just because there wasn't a need. You guys kind of got the idea. But I'm going to give you a couple examples right now, just so you know. For example, Vince Flaherty, a child actor, he was on the Donna Reed Show. He was a singer, and he was a frequent visitor to the Brave New World and Beat-O-Litos whenever Love was playing. So Vince maintained a cautious relationship with Arthur. Quote, "He could be a tough hombre and a force of nature. He was an asshole to me sometime, but he could also be nice." So Jack Holtzman of Elektra, you know, the band had a bit of a difficult relationship with Elektra at times. So Holtzman says, he's speaking of Lee here, "I knew he was a scoundrel, but there are scoundrels and there are charming scoundrels. But Arthur was still a scoundrel. I let Arthur get away with a lot of stuff. On that first night, he said to me, before I sign, I need $5,000 in cash, and I need it to buy something for the band to tour in." So yeah, these things happen. But this book and Forever Changes by Anderson are full of examples like this. Every few pages, Lee is mouthing off on something or another. You know, so he had a reputation, and to not report that in some way would be biased. Another thing, this was kind of interesting. I actually left this on the cutting room floor, and this is Michael Stewart Ware's book again. Two instances where the band was going to be filmed. One was a club where they were playing live, and they were being filmed, and I think the film crew, well, there was several guys, a couple cameras, and Arthur Lee, for whatever reason, didn't want to be filmed, and he took the guy's camera away from him and put it at the back, behind the curtain, by the back of the stage where they were performing. And this kind of brought the filming to a close. The other guys were just, what's going on here? They just kind of packed up and left. So there was another incident, and this was after Forever Changes. And UCLA was going to do some filming of the band, and this was for promotional purposes. And this is shortly after they did the single Laughing Stock and Your Mind and We Should Belong Together. So this I believe was early 1968. So the crew gets there with the band, and Arthur's late. And when they get there, they're going to go into the house. This is Arthur's house, the Trip House. Now, this Trip House had some gravitas. Film students were interested because that movie was shot there. And Arthur's going up to the door, and he realizes the door's open. Pushes it open. He's like, "Were you guys in here?" And the film crew goes, "Well, yeah, the door was ajar, so we walked in and called for you. And realized you weren't there. We came back out and closed the door." So Arthur put them through a big ordeal. I got to check and see if everything's here. So he goes to the extent to say, well, there was a $20 bill here on the kitchen counter. Now it's not here. So he went through this big thing embarrassing these guys over a $20 bill that these guys denied. And then once things calmed down, he's, well, okay, let's start shooting. Well, these guys this was a very quick shoot. And they were going to come back later in the week and finish up. That was the end of that. It never happened. So that's according to Michael Stewart Ware. So you've got these biases, I shouldn't say biases, but I'm not saying that's not true, but you have Michael Stewart Ware here giving a much more negative stories about Arthur Lee than I've ever heard in the many interviews I heard from John Echols. And Echols, as I said, had a longer relationship with him. So maybe that accounts for it. Arthur maybe treated him better. I don't know. But you get these stories from different members, and they've got their perspective, you know, so you kind of figure it's probably somewhere in the middle. One other thing I wanted to bring up here, this is also from Anderson's book, has to do with some of the publishing. So at some point, Arthur Lee sold the rights, or his grassroots music catalog. And among those songs were 4 Brian McLean songs. So I think this was after Brian McLean died. They had to try to get the control of those 4 songs. And it took some time, but this was really not Arthur Lee holding them. It was the new publisher that owned them. But Arthur Lee sold them along with everything out. Possibly he didn't realize that, maybe you don't think of that after 20 years, But these are the stories that keep piling up. And it doesn't always make Arthur Lee look good, even though he may have been innocent in that predicament. You got to chase down your money. That's just part of how it is. One of the things that McLean did accuse Lee of was that he played an unsuccessful reunion with Lee in 1978 on 2 dates but wasn't paid. So that's according to Brian McLean. So, I mean, these stories go on. And, like I said, I could do a whole video on stories on Arthur Lee, but what's the point? Really the point is the music. And I did spend a lot of time in these 2 videos talking about the music, which is really the point of these videos. Now, one of the things I can tell you, the one time I did have an interaction, or I did see Love live, and this is Arthur Lee with John Echols. This was in the early 2000s. It was Forever Changes reunion, I believe. So the one time I could actually witness this guy in the flesh, he ends up having some incident backstage with somebody, because this is a show where the Zombies were opening up for Love. So it was a great show, great build. Arthur Lee comes out on stage, and before he sings anything, he starts talking about a guy, I don't know if it's a promoter or the guy that manages the venue, but he called him a little black thief. And I'm telling my buddy Paul, I'm like, oh boy, this could be a rocky show. And I have no idea why he felt the need to say that to his audience before any of the songs began, but he did. And as it turned out, it was fine. He went into the set and everything was perfectly fine, put on a great show. But even my singular encounter with the guy was something that was, I guess, a little bit off. That was not quite, it was off-putting, let's put it that way. So anyway, that's Arthur Lee. I mean, it doesn't detract from his brilliance of a songwriter or detract from his artistic temperament or his artistic writing or playing or any of that. So all that is there. And generally speaking, most people can understand that and focus on the music. So, but that's just a little background I wanted to give you on that, because these things do pop up here on Pop Goes the 60s. And it's a nice little way to, I think, end some of the videos that I do in the band histories. As always, I've got plenty more bands I'm working on. I just was out of town this last week, and I was working on research for about 3 different bands, and they're a little bit more extensive, so I was getting kind of excited to work on them. But they will take some time for me to have them come out. But do stay tuned to Pop Goes the 60s.